Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you very much for all being here today. And I'm just going to give just a general introduction to what we mean by practical ethics and the sorts of the diverse range of issues that practical ethicists are concerned about, and ourselves too, as people who reflect on the various ethical problems or issues that we encounter in our day-to-day life. I just want to double check first that everyone can hear me okay? Perfect, that's great, thank you. And also I just want to flag at the outset that over the next number of weeks, we will be discussing topics that might be rather emotive for some people. And I just wanted to reiterate the importance of us all striving to retain a balanced, courteous approach when listening to others' viewpoints. This is always very important for a fruitful and productive ethical discussion. So just that at the outset. Okay, so starting with just a few scenarios to imagine or envisage. So you watch the film Babe, a film in which a lovable pig is saved from the butcher's knife. And this prompts you to think about whether and when you are justified in eating meat. You see images of starving children from distant countries on the television, and this prompts you to reflect on whether and how much you ought to do by way of help. You read about a terminally ill person's legal fight to change the law on euthanasia in the UK, and this prompts you to think about whether and when euthanasia should be permitted and legalized. So when you ask such questions and think about these things, you are engaging in practical ethics. So anytime you think about a concrete or specific real-world moral problem, or even a potential future problem that may develop with changes that are emerging in the world as we know it, you are engaging in practical ethical reflection.
Ticket again. Then,
so what do we mean then by practical ethics?
Emma, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? Sorry. Your slides aren't moving on.
Oh,
so I don't, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
No, that's all right.
I have moved myself, and I'll stop sharing and try again. Sorry about that.
Okay.
It's moving on my screen now. 1 second there now. I'll share again. I've shared same as usual. I'll just see if anything makes a difference here. If I share this, am I on a different slide now?
You are, yes. Perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's
thank
all
you
good.
for telling me.
Thanks.
So I just, I'll go back now and just see, does it move? Just so these were my little images about the pig and stuff. Can you see that now?
We can, yes. Thank you very much.
So shout if it stops moving again. I'm sorry, I don't know why that was. Okay, so I'm asking what we mean by practical ethics. And hopefully those scenarios will have given us a hint is what we mean. So practical ethics is the application of ethics or moral philosophy to practical issues. So it's the use of philosophical methods and moral theories to deal with specific real-world ethical problems or issues or practices that have ethical ramifications. So it's a subdivision or branch of moral philosophy, more generally. What then is moral philosophy? So it's the discipline concerned with reflecting upon right and wrong, or how we should live our lives in relation to others. So practical ethics is one subdivision of moral philosophy. So moral philosophy is generally thought to have 3 rough subdivisions. Of course, there's overlap between the 3 and it's not so clear cut, but we usually talk about these 3 subdivisions. So the first is meta-ethics. So some of you may have heard of the term meta-ethics before. And anything meta, when you put meta in front of anything, it usually means the bigger picture or the outside questions or the questions surrounding the thing that you put the meta in front of. So meta-ethics are questions surrounding ethics or moral philosophy. So questions like, what is morality in the first place? Where do moral claims come from? Are they things that just exist out there in the world, or are they things that we construct? ourselves as a community or a group? questions such as why be moral anyway? Things like that. So that's meta-ethics. So they're the more theoretical, abstract, very difficult questions that a lot of people think that philosophers might do all the time in what people might say is ivory towers, even though these questions still have are very important for informing later questions. If we think, for example, that we have no reason to be moral, then a lot of the later questions are redundant. A second subdivision of moral philosophy is normative ethics. So this branch is concerned with constructing, through reasoned argument, general principles or rules about what we ought to do. So whether they're trying to find whether there's some rules about how we ought to live our lives in relation to others that we can apply across the board, whether there's a general moral principles that we should live by. Whereas practical ethics, in contrast, how it differs is it has a very strong practical commitment, and it's more bottom-up in its approach, in that practical ethicists are focused on looking at specific problems and then looking at the moral reasons that we might have for or against pursuing a particular course of action, and then using philosophical methods to deliberate and reach agreement about what we ought to do in these cases. Rather than just trying to apply. So they will utilize moral theories that are formed within normative ethics, but they will also look at the specifics of the situation and try and see the reasons that sometimes conflict, and trying to reach some consensus in that case. The methods that are used are sometimes use of examples, thought experiments to picture a situation and to try and elicit intuitions. And also sometimes analyzing concepts, what we mean by certain concepts like freedom or autonomy or respect. Okay, so that's what we mean by practical ethics. So I hope that makes sense. So what sorts of problems then are practical ethicists concerned with? So there are a whole host of things that real world problems that have ethical issues and ethical ramifications. So one big area of practical ethics is concerned with issues that arise in biology and medicine, so sometimes known as bioethics or biomedical ethics. And here we have, again, many different types of questions or issues. So they're beginning of life ethical issues. So questions like, should we pursue stem cell research? When, if ever, or under what circumstances might it be permissible to abort a fetus? Questions like that. So again, questions that are very important and also very controversial. Questions about end of life matters. So is it permissible for a physician to assist assist someone who wishes to die? Is it permissible to assist someone who wishes to die because they feel their life is no longer worth living? Should assisted dying be allowed within the law? What sorts of concerns have we when it comes to end-of-life decision-making in children? People who are not able, for various reasons, to consent to these decisions. Other questions then about healthcare resource allocation. So when there's a scarcity of resources, for example, in the recent pandemic, we were all very much aware of the shortage of ventilators, the shortage of resources at the beginning of the pandemic, and also then vaccinations and the distribution of vaccinations. How do we prioritize in situations of shortages, how we allocate resources? Then questions about the practice of healthcare. So what sort of rules or principles should healthcare professionals abide by or work by? So many years ago, there was a medical ethics revolution, in the sense that prior to the late 20th century, there wasn't a very well established code of ethics for healthcare professionals to work by. And it is through the work of practical ethicists, policymakers, and and others working in law and other fields of research, that we now have very strict rules by which healthcare professionals have to work by. So codes of ethics that require doctors to obtain informed consent before they carry out any procedures, and also doctors are required to abide by principles of beneficence in their care of patients. So things like that. And also public health issues. Then how do we deal with public health problems while respecting the autonomy and the well-being of individuals, and then balancing this against concerns for public health? So these are all things that practical ethicists engage with. Another branch of practical ethics focuses on our duties to and our treatment of non-human animals. So questions about when, if ever, is biomedical experimentation on animals permissible? When, if ever, is it permissible for us to eat meat? Under what conditions do animals need to be raised in for our practices of raising them to be ethical? What responsibilities do we have to our pets? What duties do we have to them, given that we have domesticated very many animals and taken them into our homes and lives? What duties do we have then to wild animals? Animals who are frequently suffer very many hardships, disease, parasites, and erosion of their environments. Do we have duties to intervene to help them when they are suffering, and under what circumstances? So these are all very interesting questions, I think, that practical ethicists are engaged with. And there's a host of other issues. So over the course of the 10 weeks, you'll be discussing specific issues, one each week. And here's just some range of things that more generally practical ethicists are concerned with. So questions about climate change. Who should bear the burden of making adjustments to how we operate and work things in the world in order to mitigate the problem of climate change? Do individuals have responsibility as well as collectives? What are our duties with respect to the global poor? So given that very many people in the world live in absolute poverty, what duties do we have to try and help or alleviate this poverty? Do we have duties as individuals, and to what extent? Questions then about the ethics of war. Can there ever be a just war? What are the conditions that would make going to war or continuing a war just? Who are the legitimate targets within a war zone? Who is immune and who is not a legitimate target of fighting? Questions then about criminal punishment. So is punishment of those who have offended morally justified? What reasons, if so, do we have for justifying our practices of punishment? And what kinds of punishment are not justified? So these are, again, very important questions. And with the advent of new technologies, very many new technologies, and one being the advent of artificial intelligence, there's a whole host of questions that arise, ethical questions about our use of artificial intelligence. So questions about the impact that artificial intelligences may have on our privacy and things like that. And also questions then about the moral and legal status of artificial intelligence, AI agents. So as you can see, practical ethicists work very closely and rely on the input of many theorists from other disciplines, so sociologists, lawyers, psychologists. So often the methods that practical ethicists use involve conceptual work, analyzing concepts, offering reasons, trying to pull at people's intuitions, but then also sometimes rely on empirical evidence as well and drawing it in to their arguments and to their analyses. Okay, are we okay with this? Perfect. Okay. So I wanted to just say a little bit about the program. for the next number of weeks, what is planned. So hopefully over the course of it, I'm sure it sounds all very exciting. You will have a taste of many different areas of practical ethics, and you will discuss and interrogate particular questions. So today obviously is the introduction. Next week, Alberto is going to talk about, and I think it's next week, I hope I have the order right, the ethics of restricting freedom in public health policy. So I believe Alberto is going to explore the concept of freedom, to talk about different accounts that we might have of freedom, different notions of freedom that are at play, and how sometimes when we're talking about freedom in public health policy, we're using different notions of freedom at different times. So to try and make sense of these different notions and their relationship. And then also, Alberto, I think, wants to ask how a liberal state can implement public health policies without becoming illiberal. So that sounds quite interesting and very topical, given the focus on public health in the news and media in the last few years. The following week then, I believe Roger is going to talk about the ethics of extinction and pessimism about the future. So when saying pessimism about the future, I believe what Roger is going to talk about is the idea, pessimism about the future is the view that non-existence or the extinction of the human species would not necessarily be a bad thing, would not be a bad thing. And Roger is going to suggest and discuss whether this view is reasonable and the ethical implications of such a view, if we were to hold it. Then I think Thomas is talking about the ethics of digital persuasion. So the ethical issues that arise, given that we have many new and emerging digital technologies that are capable of persuading us in unprecedented ways, advertisements, online news feeds, various things like that. So Thomas is to provide an introduction to the ethical issues that arise in this context. Again, very, very topical. Muriel then is going to talk about the ethics of acquiring self-knowledge through technology. So there are many, again, new and emerging technologies that sometimes can provide us with information about ourselves. So let's say bioinformation, like health and activity trackers, or genetic testing, very many other things. And Muriel is going to discuss, and you're going to see whether we, what reasons we might have, what ethical and practical reasons we might have for utilizing these technologies to acquire information about ourselves, and exploring then the ethical issues that these opportunities for technologically acquired self-knowledge raise, the ethical issues that are raised by using these sort of things. So then again, that sounds very interesting. Then I think it's Mattia is talking about the ethics of consciousness after that, whether consciousness, which consciousness meaning that it's something like to be or to experience something, whether consciousness is valuable in and of itself, whether it's grounds our moral status, or to what extent it grounds moral status, and the extent to which the quality of our conscious experience influences or impacts upon or contributes to our well-being. Related to this then, Mette is going to talk about the value of literature for consciousness ethics. So the contribution that literature can play when trying to analyze concepts such as consciousness, selfhood, and personal identity, the potential for fictional narratives in our discussion of these concepts. Then Sasha is going to talk about the ethics of direct climate action. So direct climate action is when tactics are utilized to try and precipitate or encourage or incite policy change for the sake of the climate. Tactics such as, let's say, blowing up a pipeline or sabotaging a building to try and promote or to provoke policymakers into acting given that it's quite an urgent problem. And many people talk that many argue that these sort of tactics are necessary to prompt change. So Sasha is going to explore when, if ever, is direct climate action permissible. Then Gary is going to talk about the ethics of creating people. So what we should think about the morality of creating people. So there's arguments, some people argue that, well, a lot of people think that when we create new beings, that it's a morally neutral state of affairs. But there are arguments to say that there may be some negative impact of creating, or that there will be ethical reasons against creating new people. And then others argue that we have actually ethical reasons for creating new people. So Gary is going to explore these questions and issues on week 9. And then I'm back again in week 10 to explore the ethics of neurocorrection. So neurocorrection is something that I've been working on for the last few years, and it means, what I mean by neurocorrection is the use of interventions that exert a direct physical, chemical or biological effect on the brain within the context of criminal justice for the purpose of promoting the rehabilitation of those who have offended. So I'll be exploring questions about this. When, if ever, is it permissible to utilize these sort of interventions to promote persons' rehabilitation? And what worries might we have about utilizing these interventions? What issues are at stake? What problems are there if we were to utilize them? And what reasons then do we have for using them? There may be some moral reasons why we should utilize these also. So again, I hope that all makes sense. It looks like it's going to be an exciting number of weeks with a good bit of variety in the topics discussed, and then some overlaps as well, which will hopefully help people build and make connections between these different areas. So that's the end of my bit of discussion, and hopefully we'll discuss more now with some questions.